Okay, well, firstly, thanks for asking me to do this. And I thought you've seen, now you've seen about the first 15 minutes of that film. I'm going to talk about that film quite a lot, but I thought I would start where I usually start my talks, in that it's quite appropriate, really, considering where we are at the moment in terms of how we're sort of stuck in our homes or in apartments or whatever. Is that really the first exhibition I made that I was happy with as an artist and that I felt worked as an artist was actually in my house, my parents' house. I lived with my parents till I was 30, and when they were about when I was about they were about I was about 26 or 27. I was still living there, and they went on a holiday for 2 weeks, and so I took over the whole house and turned it into like an installation, really, without them knowing. So I basically took down the art that they'd bought at sort of, the sort of bad sort of watercolors and things that they bought, and just put up my own work. And this is a photograph taken of my bedroom at the time. It's very untidy, and I did some paintings for the bedroom, like a life cycle painting about a rock musician who died. And then like I said, I just took over other rooms. Let me just try and work out how to change the slide. There we go. That room is self-explanatory, I'd like to think. So this is the sort of standard decor in my parents' house, but also what there is, you can see on the walls of the toilet, I hope it's clear enough, are pieces of paper. And those pieces of paper represent graffiti from the men's toilets at the British Library, which was at that time a very old-fashioned library, nothing computerized, in the centre of London at the British Museum. Very, very odd people used to go there, academics, but also some very eccentric people. And there's, like a lot of libraries, there's always a sort of element of sort of sexual tension in it. And often that sexual tension was sort of came out on the walls of the toilet, as it were, and in the sense that there were a lot of arguments between academics and intellectuals. They'd start arguments with each other, and they'd be continued on the walls. They'd say each other puzzles and questions. There'd be wordplay and games and poems that people would write, and other people would write poems as well. A lot of it was very, very rude, very almost pornographic, very funny as well, and kind of spoke, I felt, greatly of sort of sexual frustration. So that's really, in a sense, the beginning of kind of my career as a conceptual artist, if you want to call it that. I'll use that term. We can discuss it afterwards if anyone wants to sort of interrogate me on what it actually means. But in a way, what you've just seen with that film, and my sort of proper career as an artist started in 1996 when I did this diagram. And what you see with that film is basically this diagram come to life. So for a long, long time, I've been thinking about the British dance music in the 80s and early 90s and its importance socially and historically. And I had an idea for a brass band, which is effectively a sort of industrial form of music making, to make acid house music, to play cover versions of acid house songs. And of course, acid house is a sort of post-industrial digital music making form of music, effectively. As you've seen from that film, it started in Chicago and Detroit in the mid-80s, gay clubs, black gay clubs, and then came to Britain, was taken and was adopted by the sort of mass audience in the UK of young people of all sexual persuasions and sort of all ethnicities as well. It became like a mass movement. And so socially, it was a very important, interesting moment because it came in the middle of a decade, or just after the middle of a decade, which was basically, we were under the rule of Margaret Thatcher, so a very right-wing, authoritarian government. And of course, that created many tensions in society. So all these young people dancing and enjoying themselves, taking drugs, came 2 years after the miners' strike, which was a huge, massive sort of mobilization of the state against unions. And the police and the government treated these young people in a very similar way they treated miners. So it became a very contentious time when they were trying to close down parties and have roadblocks to prevent people going to parties and so on. So weirdly, this music of brass bands, which was basically a music of industry, does relate to acid house music, not least because brass band music was music made by industries that were not existing anymore as well. So it's like it's a music of the past, but also music that had a lot of associations with deindustrialization and trade unions. And so there's that kind of feel of sort of solidarity and kinship around that music. And acid house music had that as well about it, almost accidentally. So for me, it shows how my mind works. It shows how I feel about music, especially in politics and their relationship. For me, you can't really separate the music that's being made at a time from the history or the social history of that time. So that's what that diagram really is doing. It's showing that everything is connected, basically, and everything really, you can't separate these things out from each other because they're all made, and they all inform each other, basically. So that was the diagram, and really that was because what came from that diagram were a series of concerts where a brass band, that's the brass band I use. I'm just going to close the window. That's the brass band. So like I said, it's a very traditional form of music making. At this point, when I worked with this brass band in 96, 97, the band was all male. There are no women members, there are now. But it's a very male-dominated movement because it sprouts from heavy industry and coal mining and steel and iron and so on. This is a band that's associated with an engineering company in Manchester. And really this band and working with them just liberated me as an artist, really, because before then I'd been making objects and trying to do paintings and all sorts of things. And I still do that up to a point. The things I'm probably best known for and I'm best at, if that's the right way, it sounds a bit boastful, the things I like doing most are this sort of open-ended, free-form, lose control type projects in the public realm, if that's a way of putting it. And this was certainly that. And what working with this band taught me was that actually the general public, in Britain at least, were quite interested in artists and what artists were doing. And so it was quite easy. I was shocked at how easy it was to work with them. I rang up the manager of this band and I said, would you be interested in playing this music? I didn't use the word acid house because I knew that had quite bad connotations with drugs. They might not want to do it. And they said, yes, we'll do it once. And I said, actually just said, I want to play some contemporary electronic music. And I said, yes. And they said, yes, we'll do it once and we'll see how it goes. And it was as easy as that. So we did one concert and the concert went very well and people loved it. The band weren't sure if it was going to go well or not. They were very nervous, but they played and then they were overwhelmed by the reaction. So they still play it. This is just a clip of them from a video of them playing it a few years ago at a dance music festival where they were treated like rock stars, you know. So they were very happy for them. It was a bit of an adventure, really. And I always wanted it to be that. I didn't want to make them feel that they were being in any way. It was a way that I was sort of making comedy of what they were doing. I suppose that's the best way of putting it. I wanted them to be strong within what they were doing and enjoy it. And like I said, it was sort of an adventure because we never really knew where or when it would end. And now they do these performances. I don't even know they're doing them because I'm not really interested because it's something that I've done and I've just basically let them get on with. So I'm quite happy to do that. So going back to the diagram, when I was asked to make a film, 2018, I was asked to make a film. Freeze magazine had been given a sum of money by Gucci to make 4 films about dance music culture, and it was to coincide with the sort of Summer of Love in '88, so like a 30th anniversary. And I was asked if I'd make a film about London, and I said no, I'll make a film about Britain because actually London, the story for London isn't as interesting as you might think. It's a sort of national story about this music and what it did to people. And they basically left me alone. And I made the film that you just saw a little piece of. It's quite helpful that you saw that in a way. Um, just going, yeah. So basically, I made a film about this diagram, and the diagram I'd made in 1996. So 22 years later, I make this diagram effectively into a film. So I made a film about dance music in Britain in the 80s, but also by stepping back, I tried to make a film about the 80s and the mid to late 80s in Britain, and why this music maybe was so popular, but what had come before, and why the atmosphere in Britain was so specific at that moment, and what that meant for the music, and what it meant in terms of the social history of Britain. So what I didn't want was to make a film about, a lot of music documentaries can be just like a lot of middle-aged men sitting in front of mixing desks or all their synthesizers, and I didn't want to do that. Having said that, there is a middle-aged man in the film a lot, which is me. But I wanted to make a film where I went into a school and talked to a group of 16 to 18-year-olds about what it was like for me, or what it was like in the 80s as I saw it, mid to late 80s. And sort of give them a history lesson in a sense, but a bit more interactive than that, because you see they play instruments and so on. But it was just to sort of get their perspective on those times and what they thought of it. What's interesting is you don't see that until a bit later in the film, but the young people start talking to me and asking me questions and making comments about things. So, for example, there's one example that made me very surprised, because we were talking about the miners' strike in 1984 that went on for a year, and one of the young women asked me, did they go on strike because of global warming and the environment? Was it to do with that? Which, of course, now when you think about it, seen through that perspective of young people, that kind of makes sense. But no, it wasn't. It was for other reasons, basically. It was more ideological reasons. But so they look back on the 1980s and late 80s and early 90s with a very specific way. Also, they talk a lot about the countryside in Britain, on how they feel to be in the countryside, and then about racism and social media. And in a way, social media is the main thing they comment upon, because there's a lot of footage in the film of people at clubs and all sorts of different things, and no one's got phones, no one's photographing each other or doing this kind of self-surveillance, which we tend to get now. What I'm going to do, I'm going to show you the trailer for the film. So I'm going to try and exit these slides, if possible. I don't know if I can do it. Let's have a look. Yes, this is working. I'm going to show the trailer, because the trailer, even though you've seen a bit of the film, the trailer shows really what I was interested in terms of the film, what I was interested in covering. And we can talk about the trailer afterwards. So it's got sound on it. I'll play it full screen. I was very proud with the trailer. It's super exciting because of the track that's used, and kind of really builds up. But it'll give you it's kind of a collage, really, of what happens in the film. I'll just play it now. So I can take you through the clips, really. I might as well do that. That's a cue for a club in 1990, which at the end of the film you see. It was that footage was taken by a very young guy. I think he was 17 or 18, and he just spent the whole night in the club, just walking around with probably quite a big video camera, filming people. But he did it in such an amazing way. I mean, it's such a great archival clip, really, of just this club, one night in this club, and he does the whole queue, and the queue is really long. It's probably about 400 or 500 people. So that's the club. These are people arriving at a rave in the south of England. What I didn't talk about in the film, what I should have done really, is that in the south of England, things were very different from in the north in terms of the raves. And I do talk about this a bit, but this is people arrive. That car is a Jaguar. That's a very expensive car that people are arriving in, these young people. It's like they borrowed their dad's car for the night, not told him what they're doing. It shows that people in the south of England had a lot more money than those in the north by this time, by 1988. These are the police preventing people going to Stonehenge in 1986. In 1986, there was a massive confrontation between the police, well, 85 especially, but then 86 between people wanting to get to Stonehenge for solstice. And this whole idea about people traveling around the country in convoys is something that is techno music in the late 80s had a huge effect on that scene and made it much more popular with the public. This is some footage taken during that moment in the 1980s of people basically traveling around Britain, playing techno music at festivals, being nomads basically. Again, this is back to Stonehenge, as people walking through a village trying to get to Stonehenge. Obviously the police, a lot of activity around the police, and criminal gangs got involved because of the drug scene in the late 80s with ecstasy. Back to that, that's a folk ritual in Britain. When I talk about the countryside and chaos within the countryside and the lack of order in the countryside, which is often expressed in folk rituals. These are the police at 1984 at Orgreave, which was a huge confrontation between striking miners and the police, which I'll talk to you about in about 3 minutes. Back to the queue, police running across a field, trying to head off people who are going to Stonehenge or trying to get to Stonehenge. I just thought it was such an amazing sight, sort of a kind of urban sight really, police running through, you expect them to run through the streets of a town in a riot, but there they are running across a kind of this idyllic English landscape. It's the kids again, and then again, this is people being moved on by the police, and then back to the rave. And then we have, this is quite an important moment in the film, which you'll see later if you watch the film. These are young people in Manchester in 1986 dancing to house music, which might be the earliest footage of young people dancing to house music in Britain. All the kind of credits and so on. So there you go, you've got Gucci's thing there. And I was asked recently whether it was a problem getting money from Gucci, which you might, I actually think it's not, compared to often where you can get money from, where money comes from now for art, especially because they had no editorial control. And I just thought, yeah, I'll take your money. I'll make a film about it. So I was quite happy to do that. Anyway, so that was the film. I hope you do get to watch it somehow. It's on YouTube, I think, and I think it's on my Vimeo site as well. You can find it on that. I can send a link to Nelly afterwards if it's going to be a problem. So you've seen part of the film. The film mentions the miners' strike a lot, as does that diagram that you saw at the beginning. And this is a photograph from the miners' strike. This is something I experienced as a child. Well, not as a child, as a young person. It's a strike that went on for 1 year, but also had a big effect on me, as it did most people that lived through it, because it was such an incredible moment in British history. It went on for a long time, and it sort of divided the country. Not since Brexit, really, has there been anything similar. I mean, in a way, what we're going through now is much, much more intense, I think, and will be remembered for longer in a way. But up to that point, the miners' strike was a kind of very divisive moment in British history. So it's something I'd always stuck with me. So what I wanted to do was, that footage you saw of the horses, That was a huge confrontation in June 1984, and this is on that day. That's a striking miner talking to a policeman, probably a policeman from London, who he's seen do something. He's wearing gloves as well, the policeman, so he's probably acted quite roughly, which was often the case. They brought policemen up from London to police it because they had no connection to the mines, to industrial culture, and were quite happy to beat up the miners and do things they weren't meant to do. So that's a still from that. So what I wanted to do, and I'd had it on my mind for years actually, was to restage this riot, this battle basically. So it wasn't even a riot, it was a battle. And restage it in the place where it had happened with maybe 15,000 people, you know, in real time. Like I take a whole day to do it, which of course is impossible for a number of reasons, not least budget. So in the end, we had 1,000 people and we restaged the battle. And that's one of the stills from it. I wasn't really very well known as an artist at that point. It was only 4 years after I'd worked with the brass band, and I was not that well known. I was about 30, maybe a bit older, but yeah, I was 35 actually, 34, 35. But I'd gone in for basically a competition to an open call to come up with an idea for an artwork, and I basically suggested this reenactment of the riot, of the battle, as a joke almost, because I just didn't think anyone would go for it, and they actually went for it. It was Art Angel, and they went for it. So it wasn't entirely serious. It was a challenge more than anything else. It was a provocative challenge to these people to come up to say, yes, we'll do this. And so these are some stills from it. What I really love about these stills was we had a stills photographer working with us, and she got so nervous on the day because it was quite a sort of intense atmosphere that most of the photographs she took have got camera shake. But it actually makes them much better, makes them look much more realistic. And also she shot on film rather than digital, because we had another photographer shoot on digital. And so they really have a quality about them. So we did think it was it was a piece of art, it was a piece of performance art, which is something I think is very important to say. It was filmed, but it was basically being filmed because that meant we had the budget to do it, but also it was a way of getting around permits and to get people on board who might not have liked the idea of it as an artwork. So some people we talked to a bit as an artwork, and others we said we were making a film, making a documentary film, which we were. But we just had to be careful about how it was spoken there, because people were still very upset by what had happened, but also local politicians weren't very happy with the idea, and the police weren't very happy with the idea. So we had to be very professional about how we did it. But we basically used whatever we did, whatever means we had, to make it happen. So it's basically a public piece of performance art. You can't see in this picture, but there are about between 1,000 and 2,000 people watching it. And then it became a film, became a documentary film. And what I really wanted to do was go back to a place where something had happened, something traumatic had happened, both to the people that had been there, not least the police, some of the police, but mainly the miners, because they'd been so thoroughly beaten that day, but also sort of a place of sort of national trauma, a battlefield effectively, and examine it through a reenactment in the way that crimes are reenacted often, aren't they? When, you know, children get murdered or abducted, they'll do a recreation of the crime to jog people's memories. They also do it apparently to sort of flush out the person that might have done it, might go and want to watch the recreation or get involved in some way. So that's what I was trying to do. I was trying to kind of summon up the spirits of this thing by recreating it, or digging up a body. I often say it's like digging up a body and giving it a proper post-mortem, poking around. So I was very much interested in that. It's like a public inquiry, basically. So it happened on the day, it was an anniversary almost, and it happened in the original place, more or less. This is the village it went through. But it was basically about bringing back a piece of British history that had been sort of hidden somewhat. You know, we were in the midst of a new Labour government. It was pre 9/11, so people weren't really thinking about that. They weren't obsessed with that or preoccupied by it. And it was a moment of when the British Labour government really didn't want to refer to the strike or think about it. And also as a moment when the art world was very, very interested in the market and people making money and YBAs. So I did something that was out of London, which I liked, and was about something that was super unglamorous and unpopular in a lot of ways. So that was something that made me very happy to do that. Also, it's a kind of, it's a sort of comedian, you know, it's an absurd thing to do, to recreate a riot, because you can't. And in a way, it wasn't even accurate what happened, but it was just a gesture really to do this thing. I was also very interested in the people that take part, because we work with former miners, we work with their families and local people, but also we work with reenactors, and so people like this, basically, men, effectively, mainly. Reenactors, people that like to dress up and reenact moments from history, battles from history, often Civil War battles. But in Britain, the reenactment scene is huge. People they fight sort of Roman and Celts up to Second World War. So they stop at 45, basically. They might do a bit about the Korean War, but on the whole, they stop at 1945. And that is where history ends, as far as they're concerned, in a way. But also, they don't really consider the political aspects of warfare. It's really to do with the guns and the uniforms and the tactics. So I wanted to really have them reenact a battle that was within living memory, where no one died, but was part of a campaign, a war on a culture, effectively. And so I wanted them to actually be able to fight alongside men that had been part of that campaign, i.e. the former miners. We had a few former police there, but not many, but a lot of former miners. So they got to fight alongside or against these men. And so they got a very different experience of what reenactment is and what history is. I mean, in a way, I was trying to sort of recalibrate their ideas about history and what history is, basically, in Britain, and what a battle is and what a warfare is, and so on. So it was effectively a very, very political reenactment, even though a lot of the reenactors were told it wasn't. We had someone looking after them, and he basically said it's a non-political reenactment, which is fine. If that meant he could get this thing done, then I was happy for that, because otherwise they would not have done it. I'm sure most of them would have walked. They were very, very afraid of the former miners, even though the former miners were totally outnumbered by the reenactors. They were very afraid of them. And so we had to do a lot of negotiation on the night before, because they actually thought that the former miners would start a real riot, start a real battle, which would be some sort of sign to start of a kind of revolution within Britain. They really thought that, some of them. So for them, they were very suspicious of these men. They'd read certain newspapers and believed certain things through the years about these men and what they were capable of and the kind of people they were. So it was a very interesting relationship. And if you watch the film, you'll see that there's a lot of suspicion between especially the reenactors of the miners, and they were very, very worried about it, which gave it attention. And in a way, after this, it was a very important piece of work for me. It seemed to work luckily on a lot of ways. Again, it could have been a total disaster. Like with a brass band, it could have been a disaster. Because once you sort of lose control of a work, which happens quite a lot with things I do, you don't really know where it's going to go. You don't really have much of an idea of what could happen. But anyway, I was very happy to do it. And that brings us to the present moment. I don't know if I'm going to show any footage from this, but I just made a film about a similar moment in British history, really, in terms of the divisiveness, which now, because of what's going on with the virus, seems like ancient history, but also seems quite quaint in terms of the arguments. It doesn't even seem that important in the scheme of things. But it was last year I spent some time in Parliament Square, talking to people, mainly on the right and the far right, about Britain and what they thought about Britain and what they thought about Brexit, because Brexit was going to happen, and it was just their views on the country. And so it's basically a series of observations, really. I'd gone down to Parliament Square to take a look, and I was absolutely kind of horrified and obsessed with what was going on. I was very, I wouldn't say attracted to it, but it was absolutely fascinating to see what was going on in Britain at that time. The chaos, the visual chaos, the sound that was happening with these demonstrations, because you'd have people that were pro-Europe and anti-Europe basically standing next to each other, shouting in each other's faces what they believe. It was very stressful. The police had a very difficult job, but it was something I'd never seen before in Britain. And it made me think, well, maybe this is what street life was like 100, 200 years ago in Britain, or 300 or 400 years ago. It was like something out of Hogarth, or even further back, or at least a Victorian city scene. It was a very, very strange sort of experience to walk around it and to see how people were behaving. So it was a fascinating anthropological experience, but it was very distressing as well, because it was my own country. If I'd have been in a different country, I think I could have distanced myself from it, but it was very difficult to distance myself. You can find the film online. It's on my Vimeo page, and I can send a link to you all after this. This is from the subtitled version. This is a group of people at the end of the film. A lot of people were very aggressive. They were very well schooled in how to behave in terms of what the law allowed them to do, and what was too far for the law as well. So they were it was like basically trolls coming to life. A lot of the people there were basically people who were probably trolling people as well online, but then they come into the real world and you see how they troll people to their faces, and it was very unpleasant, very, very stressful to watch. And so the film has a little bit of this in it, but not much, because you just couldn't really watch that much footage of that going on, because it was just so unpleasant. So this guy is in the film a lot. He's currently filming. What you find is a lot of people are filming live all the time. I think it must be on Facebook or YouTube. I don't know what it is, some sort of live broadcasting, basically. And so he would be broadcasting continually, as would lots of other people. And I wanted to incorporate that into the film, what they'd shot, but it was quite difficult to find. I think they were closed groups they were filming. They were sort of showing their footage to, or live streaming to, basically. This is a Marxist I met, and this is what he put on his voting slip when he voted at the European for referendum. And I just put it up as text because it was quite interesting. And he's, in a way, in the film, if you see the film, he sort of puts it into a historical context about the Great Depression, but also about the financial crash of 2008 and authoritarianism in the far right. Kind of nails it, I think. There's one moment in the film, a number of moments in the film where I suppose the thing that I find irritating when you see news reports is that they do a shot of a crowd, or they'll show someone or a flag or some insignia, but they won't actually tell you what that insignia is, or they won't really go into detail about what you're really looking at. So here I had the opportunity to do that. I was I was making my own news report effectively, and I suppose I wasn't interested in people who had the same opinion as me. I was interested in people who had different opinions from myself, almost exactly the opposite. And this was one person. Not that I spoke to this person, because it was actually quite intimidating, but he was covered in tattoos. And so in the film, if you watch the film, I'd spend about a minute and a half just deciphering his tattoos. I still the image, and then I go into some detail about what he's covered with. And a lot of it is kind of numerology to do with the Bible, football, but also conspiracy theories, some of which are based around massacres by governments of civilians, and then other stuff to do with the far right. So it was a real mix, a very strange sort of mixture of obsessions. Also war against Islam as well, and crusades, something he was interested in. I spoke to this woman in the wheelchair you see. She's one of the people I speak to. So it's basically me trying to make sense of this, or trying to find out what's in people's minds. And like I said, I spoke mainly to people on the right, or anti-Europeans and the far right. But then it's actually, I'm sure if a lot of you make films, it's actually very difficult to make something that just has one viewpoint, especially when it's so extreme and actually quite stressful. So there are moments when I speak to people who are pro-Europe, just to give some sort of it's not even a balance, just to have a breather, really, for someone like myself. And this group of young people, they're very optimistic, very positive, very interested in their role within Britain and Brexit. They'd just been racially abused by someone, but they were still very cheerful and laughing about what was going on and how excited they were to be within this sort of environment. So that was nice. I'm sort of jumping around a bit, but I hope you sort of forgive me for that. I might stop in a minute, but I'm going to go fast through one thing, and then Nelly, you should tell me if I should stop in about maybe 5-10 minutes for questions. How does that sound to you?
Yeah, perfect.
All right.
Okay, tell you 10 minutes. No problem.
I'm going to just talk about 2 more things.
Go ahead.
This very briefly. It's a photograph I was obsessed with, and in a way it's very similar to that diagram. It's a photograph of a wrestler coming back to see his father in 1973. He's at the pit where he used to work. He was a coal miner, and he comes back to show his father he's won the European middleweight title, which he's wearing, as you can see. And it's a photograph that's obsessed for years. I feel like I've worn it out by looking at it. And it's a photograph that really is about how Britain was changing from being an industrial country, an industrial culture, to being a culture based around entertainment, effectively, and glamour and the future. And it was just an image that I was obsessed with. And I ended up meeting him. His name's Adrian Street. He's still alive. He was still wrestling in his 70s. And he's quite a force of nature. That's him when he was 15 or 16, when he moved to London and became like a bodybuilder and became a pin-up, basically. Unbeknownst to him, he was a gay pin-up. He was being photographed by men and put in these little booklets and magazines, but he didn't realize actually these were like for the clientele of these magazines was almost exclusively gay. This was in London, in Soho, in the 50s. Then he had this very kind of bizarre, became more and more bizarre, almost grotesque in the way he dressed. He dressed in this sort of glam rock, transvestite way. It was very unusual at the time. This is when he went to America. Again, very unusual to look like that in America and wrestle. And his whole thing was he would kiss his opponents and put makeup on them and so on. And that was his act, basically. And I always felt that this image, he's like a figure from William Blake poem Jerusalem, which is it's a poem about Christ coming to Britain during the Industrial Revolution and trying to make out what's going on effectively and showing the future to people. And in a way, that image of him and his father is like him. It's a prophetic image of him showing the future to industry. This dark industry, and there he is, all shiny and sort of almost sci-fi. Not that he saw it like that. He hated his father, and so for him, it was an image of revenge, effectively. This is what I'm going to finish talking about. It's about a kind of failure, almost, or initially a failure. It was to do, I was asked to come up with an idea to put an object on the 4th plinth in Trafalgar Square in 2007, I think it was. And my idea was to take a vehicle that had been destroyed in Iraq during the war, during the invasion and the subsequent civil conflict, the civil war, effectively, and put it on top of the plinth in Trafalgar Square and then watch it rot for a year. So it just became nothing. Here's a Photoshop image of what it could have looked like, something like that. And it would have just been this piece of evidence in Trafalgar Square that would just die in front of you, in front of your eyes. It would have been rusted, and then it would have just made this horrible mess on the plinth. So in a way, I really wanted to bring something from the war into the center of London. And this is an area, Trafalgar Square, is, it's very famous, full of tourists, with National Galleries opposite, but also it has all these, it's surrounded by buildings that were used by the Empire and the Commonwealth. The South Africa House and Canada House are in that square. So it's all about the power of the Empire and British imperial ambition. So I just thought, well, we should bring this back and we could actually see what's going on, basically. But it didn't happen. I didn't get the commission, which is hardly surprising, really. But I did manage to get a car from a curator, Robert Clodier, I think he's pronounced it, he was from Amsterdam, I think. He'd managed to get 2 cars out of Iraq 2 years previously. And he'd heard that I was trying to get a car, but it was proving very difficult and actually very dangerous. And he said, well, I have a car, just take it. And so what I did was, it was in an exhibition, but also more, for me personally, more importantly, with Creative Time, this organization in New York, I took the car and I towed it across America in public. It was towed by this vehicle with the sign on the side saying this car was destroyed by a bomb in a Baghdad marketplace on March the 5th, 2007. And basically, I took an American soldier and an Iraqi civilian with us, and we just turned up in towns. We went through the south, so we went through Republican areas, quite right-wing areas, and we just hung around and spoke to people who turned up, and we gave them a little flyer and explained what we were doing. And again, it just like with the thing in Trafalgar Square, what I wanted to do is basically just taking a big piece of evidence and showing it to the American people, really. Yeah, it was just taking something really ugly and kind of disgusting and awful into their everyday lives and just to see what the reaction was. So in a way, it was potentially quite a risky thing to do. We did it in 2009 in February, March, April. Well, it was March and April 2009. Obama had just been made president, and the country seemed to be quite relaxed compared to where it is now, definitely. So people were quite interested in it and wanted to talk about it. We had a lot of people come up to us. People didn't know they were going to see it that day when they left their houses or flats or whatever, because it wasn't really advertised as such. So people really came across it unexpectedly. And so you never really knew who you were talking to when you went up to people in the street and gave them the flyer explaining what you were doing. So you have to be very careful about how you handle the public. And quite interestingly, the Iraqi civilian is the guy there sitting on the side, who's sitting on the wheel arch, and the American soldier is not there. When we started doing it the first day, they were very nervous. And I thought, well, if you're nervous and you've been in real life-threatening situations in Iraq, then I should be nervous too, because we didn't really know what to expect. We didn't know how the public would react. And in a way, this is probably the most intense public art project I've done, because we just had no idea really what was going to go on. We had no idea really what the public would do, how they would react to us. And so it taught me a lot about how to be. Very clear idea about what they'll be like when you do them. They come fully formed in my mind, at least, and you just try and keep that idea that's fully formed, try and protect it as much as you can from the compromises you might have to make down the line, effectively, with budget and with the idea and with logistics and so on. That one really came out almost exactly as I'd hoped in terms of how it looked, and not necessarily the reception, but just how it felt and how it looked to be there. A lot of people saw the car from their cars. So in this photograph, there's a woman there looking at it, and she was taking photographs as well. I suppose the thing for me, it was good to be in America, which is this country where a car is idolized, and then tow around a destroyed car. Also, a lot of people in America have connections to the military in a way they don't in Britain. A lot of people get through college because of that. So when you go to universities, you bump into people that had served, that had been to Iraq, and so they had their stories. We've met Iraqis, we met all sorts of people. So for example, I'll just go back. So in this image, for example, the woman in white, she'd worked in the green zone, which was where the American army and the administration was centered as like a city within Baghdad. And she had all these stories about what was going on there, about prostitution ring, all these things. So you hear the kinds of things you wouldn't necessarily hear on the news, really, when you just get one person telling you about their experience. And so it's incredibly revealing. The car now is in London. It's in the Imperial War Museum. It's in the entrance to the Imperial War Museum. It's one of the main exhibits. So it's seen by thousands and thousands of people every day, or was, until all the museums closed. I could stop now and we could talk. I'm just trying to work out what the time is. I've probably talked for about 2 minutes.
I think if you can do 15 minutes of conversation with
Absolutely.
us, amazing.
Shall I just keep on the share thing? What do you want me to do?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, you can, like, if you want, it's probably a good idea to keep it shared because you might want to
Okay,
show some work as
sure.
the question kind of come in.
Okay.
So I see a question from Shada. Shada, are you here? You were talking about the music inside the film. I'm seeing this question quite early on. Shada Jada, I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing your name right, but if you want to take on the microphone and go on our screen, you should be able to see Shada full screen, Jeremy.
Okay.
Hi. No, I just remember watching the film, and the sound was really powerful to me. So I still remember like the chanting and the slogans of the miners and the reenactors. So I was just making a comment about that because a lot of what you're showing were just stills, but the sound to me was what I remembered from it.
Well, I mean, yes. I mean, there were. I mean, what was interesting was when we made the film. This is about the miners' strike reenactment. Of course, when as soon as those miners sort of went back to that place and were confronted by men dressed as police, not necessarily policemen, but men dressed as police, it brought up for them a lot of memories. And so a lot of that was just spontaneous. They just started chanting spontaneously, and some of them really got into character massively, and were so brilliant in the way that they sang, but also how they behaved. It's like they slipped back 17 years back to that moment and were really sort of method acting it, but almost they were possessed, it felt, some of them. I mean, they were really, really emotional and quite intense for them. And I think, you know, a lot of this is something I didn't say, but a lot of kind of socially engaged art, which is not really called anymore, is it? I don't know what it's called, this kind of thing. It did have that name for a while. It was always about making the world a better place and, you know, communities and all this kind of thing. But I was always trying to make, I was actually trying to make this kind of unpleasant experience in a way. And I wasn't trying to make the world a better place after it had happened. I was trying to raise up something. A bit like with this, with the car. I wasn't trying to sort of heal the wounds or heal the world. I was actually trying to do something else with the world. I'm not quite sure.
So we have a question from Amir Mohamed Azizi. Are you here? You're talking about Iran.
Iraq?
No, Iran, actually.
Oh, he is. Oh, Iran, right.
So Amir, are you there? You're actually making a reference to Iran.
Oh, he is, right, okay.
Amir, if you want to take on the microphone.
I'm all yours, Amir.
Where are you? We lost you into the black hole of the internet. Okay, well,
We'll come back to you.
You're basically saying that you had this experience of reusing some of the slogans that were used during Islamic revolution against it. This was kind of a super powerful emotional scene where people were trying to reenact what they watched from TV during 40 years of propaganda of Islamic regime and use it against its value. I mean, it would be great if you can share that. Like Amir, I don't know if you are still with us.
Well, it's quite interesting because he mentions that because during the Russian Revolution, after the Russian Revolution, they started doing reenactments of the storming of the palaces, of the sort of liberation of cities. So, but it's quite interesting that they're saying that recently in Iran they were taking those revolutionary statements and using it. Yeah.
And
yeah, here I am.
You are there. Okay, so
yeah. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute my microphone. Yeah, the experience was like that. The people were out, they were enchanting that they are exactly using the same slogans that they were using in like 40 years ago. Their fathers were using the slogans, but they were now using the slogans against their fathers' values. And it was really interesting. And they were always trying to just reenact and represent what they have saw from TV, from the propaganda, from and the experience was really powerful. You know, you were just you know, everybody were there. The slogan was not for the sake of telling something against the regime, but it was just for the sake of reenactment, and it was like making them become more angry of what you are doing.
Well, it's quite, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? It's a sort of ironic use of that language and that rhetoric, but it's ironic isn't a strong enough term. Ironic is more like jokey, you'd think, but it's actually, it shows that you know your history, and when you use those people's words against them, I think that's really important. I mean, it happens all the time, doesn't it? I mean, even now we have a government that keeps repeating certain phrases, keeps repeating them, I mean, if you repeat the phrase back to the government against them, I think it's very powerful to do that, to start reflecting. You know, it's like holding a mirror up, isn't it, really? And reflecting
exactly.
back. And it's like they can't really deal with that because they thought they owned those words, but actually you're using them against us. It's a very, very good piece of, very efficient piece of propaganda, because you're taking all their power and basically deflecting it back onto them. It's like some martial art, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
It's good. It's really good.
Do you have this reenactment sort of camp in Iran, as well as you know, they are in the UK? Because in the UK there is a lot of reenactment where you can perform like if you were in the medieval age, or you know, and so forth. Do you have that kind of, you know, camp or entertainment?
For sure, I think there should be some, but I'm not aware of them.
Okay. And we have a question from Ali.
I'm actually sorry. I'm sure the Shah really loved that kind of reenactment, didn't he? In the sense he liked all the kind of the history, ancient history of Iran, and probably tried to reenact battles and get people to dress up as these kind of ancient warriors.
Yeah, exactly. He loved to do that.
All that kind of. I mean, also in Britain, people in Britain are obsessed with history. They're obsessed with British history, and they're also obsessed with the Second World War. And I often say it, but if you came to Britain and just turned on the TV, you'd think that the Second World War had only just ended, the way people go on about it in terms of the Brexit debate, but also in terms of documentaries. There's always documentaries about Hitler, about how Britain was so amazing in the war, all this kind of stuff. But we haven't got over it. We haven't sort of gone beyond the Second World War quite, which is a bit of a pity, really. Maybe this virus will make us go. We'll go against it. I've just lost all my images for some reason, but let's put that back on.
Maybe we can see you again. Oh, you're going to share?
Do you want to see me? How do I do that? Do I press stop share?
I think, yeah, you have to. Well, I don't.
Okay,
yeah.
let's see what happens. Can you see me?
We can see you great. Perfect. Okay. We have another question actually related to the related to the Iraq project.
Yeah.
Where is I've lost you, sorry. No, not Amir, we've done you. Sorry, no Amir. Let's go back. Ali Hassan. Where are you?
Hi. Thank you for your presentation. So I was just wanting to ask you that, what do you like? Okay, you went around like in the States and looking for like taking this car, but what feedback did you get from people? Like, did they ask you questions? Like, because a lot of people have different point of view towards wars. So what do you think about that? Like, what feedback did you get?
Well, it's interesting because we were worried that we might get attacked verbally, physically, people might shoot us. I mean, literally, I mean, we did worry that, you know, we tend to see the worst of America often on sort of crime dramas and all that kind of stuff. So I had that in my mind. I was very concerned that people might threaten us. But actually, it was very, and also with this film I made about Brexit, it's quite interesting that when you have groups of people, it's a problem to talking to them, because often things get very, very heated and confrontational. But if you have a conversation with one person and another person, even if you don't agree with them on more or less anything, you could still have quite reasonable conversations with them. Also, the guy we took with us, the Iraqi guy, was super well educated. He knew the Bible, he knew the Quran, he knew all these other elements from history, social history, culture. And so he was absolutely disarming of anyone who would come to him and thinking that, oh, you're Iraqi, therefore you are this kind of person, you're a terrorist, whatever, even though you'd worked for the American army. And so he would have these conversations with people, and you would literally look at them, see their faces change during a 15-minute conversation when he would talk to them about the Bible and quote the Bible back to them and all these things. So he was an amazing presence, but on the whole, for me, it was very encouraging about America. It made me very confident about America in 2009, because I was really amazed really by how polite people were and how interested they were. And you knew that a lot of the people you were speaking to didn't hold your views on the war, but they were interested in it. And I think, like I said, Obama had just been made president, and it was like what we call a honeymoon period, where he basically everyone had relaxed because it wasn't Bush anymore, and it was just a new person, and America was more relaxed about talking about it. Unlike now, you know, if you did anything now, I think life would be in danger. frankly.
And Jeremy, to bring it back to also the topic of the, of the program as well, which is, the dance and revolution and how dance can be used to kind of build new politics and, rethinking as well our relationship with politics and institutions. There is a question from Angeli here. I don't know, Angeli, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Go ahead.
Yeah. I watched the Everybody in the Place film, and it was great. There was so much like really amazing footage in there. But I was just was asking a question about how the film ended and how it kind of finished with like a comparison between like the ravers in the 90s in the UK and like the kinds of spaces made by Black queer communities that came before them. And I was just kind of interested in like what this comparison was, given that a lot of techno like kind of increasingly was whitewashed, and kind of like what was it about that connected these two communities to you?
Well, I mean, obviously it began in Black underground gay clubs in the mid-80s, that sound, which is acknowledged in the film. And then it moved from those, well, I don't need to give you a history lesson, but it's definitely something in the earlier part of the film that I talk about and make very clear, because it's very important. And when it came to Britain, initially it was with Black kids basically who couldn't get into clubs. Not surprisingly, it's a very common story, but in Britain it was almost a joke in the 80s and 90s, especially in the 80s, that if you were Black, you would never be able to get into a nightclub, and you would never be able to go into town to a nice nightclub, even if you were dressed correctly, you just would not be let in, and they just say it was full. So basically these young people made their own entertainment, thankfully, because what that meant was they could do what they wanted. And so sound system culture, which had existed in Britain through reggae and lovers rock, became very important, because there's that infrastructure, and that became something that was used for that music. So it began in the Black community like 2 years before basically white people really got into it properly. And for a lot of white people, they had to a lot of them, the drug culture is what got them into it as well. So that's talked about in the film. But in Britain, it became a mass movement. This music became such a huge movement very quickly, because it was basically needed, because the political situation had been so grim for so many people. It was like a release. And so it became adopted by sort of mass audience in a way that it didn't really do that in America till later, from what I know. So very quickly, it left sort of the Black and definitely the kind of gay and the Black scene in Britain, and became a sort of mass movement with young people, teenagers effectively. So yeah, it changed, definitely changed. But interestingly, the teacher in the film, you see him at the beginning, the guy who's taking the roll call basically of the students. He's gay and he's out with his students, and he was part of that scene in New York and also in the UK in the mid-80s. And he said it was the first time that as a gay man, he would go into a club where there weren't people who were gay as well, who were straight, because it was a great leveler in terms of how people behaved. Because the clubs were very dangerous, actually quite dangerous places in Britain in the 80s. These city centre clubs were kind of quite violent places. So you wouldn't really want to go there. You had to dress like you were going to a wedding almost, or to work to get in. And then there's a lot of threatening behaviour in them. So it transformed that. You couldn't really go back to that after you'd been to these clubs. But yeah, it's a very important part of the film. And so the first sort of 10 minutes or so, it's when I talk about those clubs and those pioneers, basically.